The markets celebrated today. Oil dropped, stocks jumped, headlines declared relief, anchors smiled and said the crisis was over. And if you watched any of it and felt something was off, if some part of you sensed that the celebration was too quick, too clean, too convenient, you were right. The Strait of Hormuz is open. That is real. But what opened it, what it cost to open it, what was permanently lost in the weeks it was closed, and what comes next, none of that is in the headlines. And all of it matters more than the market reaction that lasted one afternoon. I am going to give you the full picture today, not the version designed to reassure you, the version that actually explains what happened, what it means, and why the world you wake up in tomorrow is structurally different from the world you were living in 6 weeks ago. Even though the strait is open and the markets are green, stay with me through this. Because what begins as a story about oil and naval deployments becomes something far more significant. It becomes a story about American power, about who actually controls the terms of the global economy, and about a set of decisions made in Washington over the past 2 months that will define the next 20 years of geopolitics in ways that most of the commentary you are reading today has not even begun to process. To understand what today actually means, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, not in the way financial media describes it as a percentage of global oil flows and a line on an energy chart. In its full weight, this is a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it passes nearly 20% of the world's total supply of oil and natural gas, not just petroleum, the fertilizers that feed billions of people, the aluminum used to build infrastructure across Asia and Africa, the helium used in medical imaging equipment, the liquefied natural gas that heats homes across Europe and East Asia. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction. It is the arterial passage through which the circulatory system of the modern industrial world moves. Disrupt it, and you do not merely inconvenience the energy markets. You begin to strangle the global economy at its most vulnerable point. For decades, the foundational justification for American military presence in the Persian Gulf was the explicit promise to keep those lanes open. This was the core of the Carter Doctrine, articulated in 1980, that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States. Every aircraft carrier battle group deployed to the region, every basing agreement signed with Gulf monarchies, every security guarantee extended to regional partners, all of it rested on this fundamental commitment. The United States would be the guarantor of free passage. That was the bargain. That was the architecture of American presence in the Gulf. For all its complications, that architecture had an internal logic. Washington was the indispensable stabilizing force, the entity whose presence kept the lanes open and the global economy functioning. That was the deal America made with the world. And then, in the closing days of February of this year, that deal collapsed. And what replaced it revealed something about American strategic thinking that the world's governments are still processing. Following American and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, Iran moved to close the strait. This was a sovereign state responding to direct military aggression against its territory with the most powerful economic instrument available to it. And the response from the most powerful nation on earth, the nation that had spent 4 decades promising to keep those lanes open, was to add another blockade on top of the existing one. To escalate rather than de-escalate, to pour gasoline rather than water. The stated logic was that Iran was charging vessels transit fees of up to $2 million per ship to pass through the strait. And so America would interdict any vessel that had paid those fees, sealing the waterway from the American side while Iran sealed it from its own. The result, which should have been obvious to anyone who spent 10 minutes thinking it through, was not a pincer movement that trapped Iran. It was a double seal that trapped the global economy. Iranian tankers on one side, American destroyers on the other, and the world's energy supply is sitting in limbo between them. The head of the International Energy Agency described what followed as the worst energy shock the world has ever seen. More severe than the oil crisis of the 1970s, more damaging than the combined disruption caused by the war in Ukraine, more severe than all of them combined. That assessment did not come from Iranian state media or a sympathetic analyst. It came from one of the most cautious, most institutionally conservative international economic bodies in existence. When that institution says this is the worst energy shock in recorded history, it is not engaging in hyperbole. It is delivering a clinical assessment of a catastrophe already underway. Now, let me tell you what the architects of this policy appear to have genuinely failed to calculate, because the failure is not small. It is historic. Roughly 98% of Iranian oil exports are bound for China, not for Europe, not for Japan, not for South Korea, or any of the other American allies whose economies were also being devastated by this crisis. China, the People's Republic of China, is the primary, almost exclusive destination for Iranian petroleum exports. This is not a secret. This is not classified intelligence. This is publicly available trade data that any competent policy planning office would have examined before designing a blockade whose explicit purpose was to cut off Iranian oil revenues. The Trump administration knew this, and it proceeded anyway. It launched a blockade of Chinese oil supply, while simultaneously preparing to send the president to Beijing for a summit that his own administration was publicly describing as essential for bilateral stability. These two facts cannot coexist within a coherent strategic framework. You cannot simultaneously blockade your largest trading partner's primary energy supplier and expect that same trading partner to welcome you with diplomatic goodwill. China's response, delivered in the careful but unambiguous language of Chinese diplomacy, was to describe the American blockade as a dangerous and irresponsible act. In the vocabulary of Chinese diplomatic communication, that is as close to direct condemnation as Beijing typically issues. While this was happening with China, something equally damaging was happening with India. And I want you to understand the India dimension because it has been almost completely absent from Western coverage. For 2 decades, Washington positioned India as the cornerstone of its Indo-Pacific strategy, the democratic counterweight to Chinese regional influence, the partner whose relationship with the United States was described in every major American strategic document as one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. India imports more than 85% of its crude oil requirements, approximately 5.5 million barrels per day, making it the world's 3rd largest oil importer. Deeply structurally dependent on the uninterrupted flow of energy through precisely the waterway the United States had now chosen to close. India had already lost approximately 3 million barrels per day of crude that previously transited the strait. Its strategic reserves, the emergency buffer every major importing nation maintains against supply disruption, stood at approximately 30 days. 30 days. And at this precise moment, when India's energy situation was already at its most precarious, the Trump administration chose not to extend accommodations to its supposed most important Asian partner. It tightened the blockade further. The message delivered to New Delhi, whether intentional or not, was unmistakable. American strategic partnership is conditional, transactional, and will be withdrawn when Washington decides its own confrontational agenda takes precedence over your economic survival. Your factories begin to seize up, your energy reserves drain, your people face shortages, and the response from your most important strategic partner is to tighten the screws further. This is what American alliance management looked like during the blockade, and every government in Asia watched it. Every government in the global south watched it. Every government that had been weighing whether to maintain closer ties with Washington or deepen its relationship with Beijing watched it and drew its own conclusions. Analysts projecting where oil prices were headed under a sustained blockade placed the figure at approximately $150 per barrel. The International Monetary Fund, whose institutional culture is built on understatement and diplomatic caution, had already cut its global growth forecast and warned of what it called an adverse scenario. When the IMF uses the phrase adverse scenario, understand that this is the economic equivalent of a physician entering the room and asking the family to sit down. Not theoretical projections, clinical assessments of a crisis already underway. And into this situation, Iran's economy under pressure, the global economy hemorrhaging, American allies watching in dismay, came the moment that I think is the most revealing of everything that happened in the past 6 weeks. Britain did not join the blockade, France did not join, key NATO members, The oldest and closest American allies in the world declined to participate. And they did not merely decline quietly in the way that reluctant allies sometimes abstain from American adventures while maintaining diplomatic silence. British Prime Minister Starmer and French President Macron announced that they would convene an independent summit of world leaders aimed at reopening the strait, not as an extension of American pressure, not as a multilateral endorsement of Washington's strategy, as a separate diplomatic initiative premised on the implicit judgment that the American approach was wrong. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States conducts a military operation and its oldest European allies not only refuse to participate, but organize an alternative diplomatic framework aimed at reversing the American position, that is not ambiguity. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is a verdict, a collective judgment by the governments that know American foreign policy most intimately, that have the most extensive experience cooperating with Washington across decades of shared endeavor, that the policy in question is neither legally sound nor strategically coherent. Trump's response was to criticize NATO publicly, expressing profound disappointment that the alliance had not followed the American lead, while simultaneously suggesting, without evidence, that NATO members now wanted to help. This is not statecraft. This is the geopolitical equivalent of lighting a fire in a crowded room, watching every neighbor refuse to help fan the flames, and then insisting to anyone who will listen that they secretly agree with you. There is a legal dimension to this story that has received almost zero coverage in mainstream Western media, and it matters enormously for what comes next. International law, specifically the conventions governing international straits and freedom of navigation, does not grant any single state the authority to close or impede passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has spent decades invoking freedom of navigation as a core principle of international order, deploying naval assets across the world's oceans under the banner of keeping sea lanes open for global commerce. The freedom of navigation operations that Washington has conducted in the South China Sea, frequently cited as a defense of rules-based international order against Chinese revisionism, rest on precisely this legal framework. And now the United States finds itself conducting an operation that undermines the very legal architecture it has used to justify its own naval presence across the global commons. A retired American admiral, speaking publicly on the record on American public radio, described the blockade in precise legal terms. Technically speaking, a blockade of a country's ability to export goods and services is an act of war, not an act of pressure, not a coercive diplomatic tool, an act of war. That assessment did not come from an Iranian official. It came from a retired officer of the United States Navy applying the legal definitions that govern armed conflict under international law to the actions of his own government. When America's own retired military leadership is publicly stating that its government's action constitutes an act of war under international law, and when its closest European allies are organizing alternative diplomatic frameworks to reverse that action, what exactly has been preserved of the credibility that took 80 years to build? Now let me tell you about Iran's response during the blockade period. Because the response tells you everything about how this negotiation will actually unfold, and why the market celebration today may be premature. The Iranian government's response to the blockade was not the language of a government preparing to negotiate under duress. The Speaker of the Iranian parliament posted a photograph of gasoline prices at American filling stations with a caption inviting Americans to enjoy current prices, noting they would soon be nostalgic for $4 or $5 gasoline. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued explicit warnings that any military vessel approaching the strait would face severe consequences. Iranian newspapers published cartoons depicting Trump drowning in the strait. You may find that imagery objectionable. You may find the tone inflammatory, but you cannot read those responses and conclude that you are observing a government on the verge of capitulation. You are observing a government that believes, with some justification, based on the strategic mathematics visible to any serious analyst, that it is winning the war of endurance, that the costs being imposed on the global economy, on American allies, on the credibility of American strategic commitments are accumulating faster than the costs being imposed on Iran itself. That calculation is not obviously wrong. Iran has been under American sanctions in various forms for nearly 5 decades. Comprehensive sanctions, targeted sanctions, sectoral sanctions, maximum pressure campaigns of multiple generations. Every single one of them premised on the same fundamental assumption that the Islamic Republic is a rational actor that will eventually calculate the costs of resistance as exceeding the costs of accommodation. That assumption has been tested extensively. It has failed consistently, not because Iranian leaders are irrational, but because the assumption fundamentally misreads the depth of Iranian strategic patience and the degree to which resistance to American pressure has become constitutive of the Iranian state's political identity. So what has actually changed today and what has not? What has changed is the immediate temperature. The acute phase of military confrontation has paused. Iran made a calculated gesture. The United States made a calculated gesture in return. These are real developments. They are not nothing, but they are also not a settlement, not a framework, not even the outline of one. They are the opening conditions of a negotiation that has barely begun and that faces obstacles of extraordinary depth. Iran's centrifuges have not stopped. Its enriched uranium stockpile has not been dismantled. Hezbollah remains armed and organizationally coherent in southern Lebanon. Whatever the ceasefire declaration says on paper, the fundamental question of what security guarantees, if any, the United States is prepared to offer Iran in exchange for genuine strategic concessions on the nuclear file remains entirely unanswered. Iran will not dismantle its nuclear infrastructure in exchange for a temporary lifting of economic pressure. That calculation has not changed because the Strait of Hormuz is open this week. What Iran needs, if it is to make the kind of permanent strategic concessions that Washington says it requires, is a fundamentally different relationship with the international order. One in which its sovereignty is genuinely respected, its security is not perpetually threatened by external actors, and the instruments of economic coercion that have been used against it are removed not as a temporary incentive, but as a permanent feature of normalized relations. Whether the Trump administration, operating within the constraints of domestic politics and the expectations of regional allies, can offer anything approaching that is the real question. And that is precisely where guarded realism, not optimism, is the only intellectually honest position available. Let me tell you what I think this moment actually is. Because the framing matters enormously for how you understand the weeks and months ahead. This is not a resolution. This is a pause. And the difference between a pause and a resolution determines everything about what comes next. A pause means the structural conditions that produce the crisis remain intact. Iran's nuclear program continues. The sanctions architecture remains. The fundamental question of what America is willing to offer and what Iran is willing to accept remains unanswered. The ceasefire in Lebanon remains fragile, and the credibility damage that America sustained during 6 weeks of blockade, the allies who watched and drew conclusions, the partners who recalibrated, the governments across Asia and the global South who updated their strategic assessments of what American partnership actually means in practice, that damage does not reverse because oil dropped today. A resolution would require something neither side has demonstrated it can deliver. It would require Washington to offer Iran something more durable than the lifting of economic pressure. It would require Tehran to make strategic concessions that its political identity has spent 5 decades defining itself against making. Neither of those things happened today. A few ships moved, a ceasefire was held for another 24 hours. Markets exhaled. The 3 indicators that will actually tell you whether this is the beginning of something real or simply the most recent pause in a conflict whose structural roots remain entirely intact are these. Watch the strait. Whether it stays open not because Iran chose to open it today, but because a durable framework exists to keep it open. Watch the centrifuges, whether Iran's nuclear program slows, pauses, or accelerates as the next round of negotiations unfolds. And watch the south of Lebanon, whether the ceasefire holds, whether Israeli forces withdraw, whether Hezbollah's posture changes in ways that suggest a genuine shift in the regional balance. Those three indicators will tell you with far more honesty than any official statement or market reaction whether what we are witnessing is the beginning of a genuine realignment or simply the most recent pause in a conflict whose structural roots remain entirely intact. Let me leave you with the question that I believe matters most for the next chapter of this story, because it is the question that the celebration today is specifically designed to prevent you from asking. The strait is open. The market celebrated. America's political leadership declared that maximum pressure worked, that coercive diplomacy achieved its intended effect, that the blockade succeeded. But here is what actually happened. Iran opened the strait when Iran chose to. Iran linked the opening to Lebanon, a condition Iran set. Iran framed the gesture as diplomacy rather than defeat. The American blockade remains on Iranian ports, and the President of the United States posted "thank you" in capital letters to the country he spent 6 weeks trying to coerce into submission. That is not what successful coercive diplomacy looks like. That is not what maximum pressure achieving its intended effect produces. What it produces is a ceasefire that holds today and may not hold in 30 days. A negotiation that has barely begun and faces gaps that no framework currently imaginable can bridge without fundamental changes to what both sides are willing to offer and accept. And a world whose governments have spent 6 weeks watching America blockade its own allies' energy supplies, alienate its most important Asian partner, violate the legal principles it invokes to justify its own naval presence, and then declare victory when the country it was coercing opened a strait on its own terms. History is not made in a single afternoon. It is made in the patient, painful, often invisible accumulation of decisions that either build something durable or reveal that the appearance of progress was always the point. Watch the strait, watch the centrifuges, watch the south of Lebanon, and watch what China does not say. Because in this story, as in every great strategic shift in modern history, the most important actor is the one who says the least while positioning the most. The strait is open today. Whether it is still open in 30 days depends on decisions that have not yet been made. And whether the world that emerges from this crisis resembles the one your generation helped build or something fundamentally different depends on whether the people responsible for those decisions have learned anything at all from the 6 weeks that just passed. Subscribe and stay close, because the next phase of this story moves fast, and what happens in the next 30 days will determine whether today's celebration was the beginning of something or simply the most expensive pause in recent memory.